When I usually talk about movies on this channel, which are mostly Disney in this case, I always answer if one can or cannot work, because we live in a world filled with multiple ideas and stories to tell, where modern Disney likes to keep telling the same ones to keep the engine of their easy money actually going. Such is the case I presented in my opinion of why Toy Story 5 could not work, as that idea has been truly run dry and is only more destructive in its overall potential. But beyond Toy Story itself was a slew of numerous other sequels for Disney itself, including one franchise we all know and love sort of in Frozen. The franchise we all somehow fell in love with 10 years ago that is also getting a third film in its creation of a brand new trilogy. But ever since Frozen's release, and to the ire of many across the globe, the movie has kind of left a bitter taste in our mouths, where now it has become abundantly clear that these movies were rushed products that didn't properly flesh out their stories. Because overall, they aren't bad films at all by any means, and had elements that stand strong as you would expect from Disney storytelling, but they still lacked in actually having the same quality of cohesiveness like other films like Moana actually demonstrated, and of course I absolutely hate that for that fact. And also, of course, to Disney's credit, this is a problem that never actually mattered to them, because both films actually opened to explosive successes and remain to be the highest grossing animated films ever released, where it still remains to be the most attended animated films in countries like Korea and Japan. That despite their shortcomings, they just have something about them that attracts the world to actually watch them no matter what type of story they do have. And of course, because of that, why wouldn't Disney like to do it like they did to Toy Story that has had a similar level of box office success? It seems like the obvious choice considering that several other recent films haven't been great successes and all, where kids obviously adore this franchise to this day as demonstrated by their appearance in the parks. But the real question that remains on my mind is, can Frozen 3 actually work? Can another sequel to this franchise actually make for a good story considering all the faults of the previous two? It seems like an impossible task and similar to Toy Story being a brand dilution, but I honestly cannot figure out if they actually can work compared to my previous videos. Because in the past, I generally know if one movie's sequel is going to work or not, depending on its idea, but this one has been giving me a hard time despite the clear and present issues with Frozen 2. And that's something I want to address in this video considering the issues with Frozen 2 again that were very clear in the documentary itself. Because if you watch Into the Unknown, it really showed that they had no time on most of the important issues of the story to meet the set deadline of Disney for the movie's release. The year we saw Disney deliver billion-dollar hit after billion-dollar hit in each of their film divisions, either in animation and in live action, where the company itself clearly knew well they just had to release it to deliver them all the profits. And because of that, as we all know, it made the story so muddled and confused, which resulted in the lower score for the film. I mean, it was generally positive, but it was amidst the lower tiers of Disney animation in the modern era, especially with an A- cinema score, usually the lowest score that Disney films have until Strange World in 2022. This showed a clear disappointment with the film itself, where audiences of course fell in love with the original that had an A+ cinema score, really showcasing that this very film had those rush problems that really didn't make any sense at all. But now they sort of have a chance to actually probably do something with it. Not that I'm even cautiously optimistic it could even work considering all the problems it already had, but still trying to at least find what kind of story they can produce after they split them up. After all, the ending of Frozen 2 kind of left us in the same scenario as Toy Story 4, where the main two characters part ways going on their own journeys away from each other in their own separate distinct parts from where the heart of it was. I mean, they get together often, but it's just, separated from each other. A problem where they have to rejoin once again for a new adventure. I mean, Frozen isn't as bad as Toy Story in terms of what they were going for, but still, with the events of the story, it still made no sense whatsoever to be shoved in right there with no clear explanation, as the movie showed us. Like, Elsa gets frozen, sends a message to Anna, and then manages to ruin the spirit's plan of making Arendelle pay for the consequences by the dam's destruction. I mean, the entire kingdom was supposed to be destroyed in that very sequence, and that was very clear by the actual use of the dam in the story's plot. I mean, in the film itself, she does say they were finally worthy now because she was a spirit, but it did kind of ruin a whole point of how the film should have actually ended, which kind of makes things both too convoluted for both kids and adults. Like, how can you make sense of all this when you actually have these issues of the other subplots, like Kristoff trying to make it his mission to propose to Anna, all for him to actually have his own song finally, considering he barely had one in the first one, while the others actually have, trying to appease a certain part of the movie with the characters that they actually have from the very beginning. And then you have this other issue of trying to balance out Olaf as a character within the story like they did with the first, alright mediating both Elsa and Anna's relationship with some bit of comedic relief in the background, but they just hype that role up with its existential crisis that makes things more annoying and confusing. Like, he does have his moments, but it's mainly overshadowed by how he's used issues in between those important elements that kind of dilutes any meaning to the other characters. And speaking of other characters is of course the new ones like the Arendelian guards and the Nothodra that were stuck in the Enchanted Forest, who virtually have nothing other to do other than set up disappearing for the majority of the story after they get introduced to our main characters officially. Like one minute they are here, the next half like Kristoff they are just left behind in one area and only freed at the very end, appearing at the last second. They don't do anything creative with them other than the backstory of where it was kind of important to the entire world setup to begin with, to have this complex story that needed these characters and ideas fleshed out more than what was actually allowed. But of course, worst above all is removing any antagonist towards the story. Not that it would have needed one to work the way they were trying to make this story, but it still clearly lacked in that department and something a third film would probably need to actually work. But this isn't going to say Frozen 3 would work with a villain, as the first one actually was supposed to be Elsa but then changed to Hans, who is in fact one of the worst Disney actually has created. This is something the writers and directors would have to solve, as it was also revealed that co-director Jennifer Lee, who is also the chief creative officer of Walt Disney Animation, was not returning to direct as she had done so with Chris Buck for the past two films. Where of course, this still isn't her fault the movies are bad considering the issues revealed in the documentary, where both are truly talented and just couldn't actually get the best that they wanted to offer out of this. But for now, with where the story is actually at specifically, I think it really needs a villain if it's even going to work at all. If you have Elsa and Anna of charge of these two areas, then you need a third that's going to conflict with that in some way, whether it be another element or another person, or even just bringing back Hans somehow. It's just got to be there. Because as I expressed before, and as noted within the original film's production, Elsa was in fact the planned villain of the first film overall, similar to the role of the actual Snow Queen from the original story, where they worked around that to deliver a more complex, relatable character and then half-heartedly shove Hans into that very role, and by extent becoming the protagonist of Frozen 2, which also wasn't done very well enough, where now they must duel up Elsa and Anna to an equal degree, facing such a huge threat in order to work. Because I originally thought, why not make Elsa the primary antagonist again in this new story, but then quickly realized it wouldn't work because we already had her arc somewhat resolved, where she somehow also needed to shut out her sister from helping again in the second to actually find these answers for some reason, where they really do need two to battle one major force or answer they were ultimately searching for, because it's become very clear that Frozen needs a villain from the start, one who's already had intentions that directly conflict with Arendelle's and the Enchanted Forest, rather than I'm just the villain now here at the end of the story with no build up whatsoever, and then I'm just going to remove them entirely and only allude to the previous one and maybe hint that our grandfather was kind of the main villain of the overall story, but then of course he's also dead and only in the film for like 3 minutes, where I guess you can actually get my point now. Because something that could clearly benefit from Frozen the most is just having another person with powers like Elsa. I know the overall point was just to demonstrate the way a person deals with trauma in her life and elevating that point with her own powers, but I really think it could also benefit from one who is also similar to Elsa in a way, but clearly think differently by the way they are raised. Opposites in that certain situation where one is intent on destroying rather than actually saving on their side. So overall, that is a part that can work in this new story, but what about the other characters I just mentioned before and their lackluster additions to the second film? What kind of issues can you present to the Nothodra and Elsa's interactions with them, since they actually weren't fleshed out well to begin with? It's something that needs more work, as Mattias was actually sort of solved by being back in Arendelle. He can clearly help out, but I'm not sure what else they could actually do, as there wasn't actually much to go off of them just like everyone else. There was clearly a story there considering his own background different to others, and with the Nothodra himself, where they could have actually explained Frozen's unique world that offers something different that was just plopped out on screen with no real time. I really want them to use these characters to the potential they needed for them, otherwise there was actually no point in them using it at all, where you then have a Rose Tico situation via The Rise of Skywalker. Disney yet again rushing to fix the criticisms of the past, just like in The Last Jedi, by reducing the elements of that film virtually to dust. Or if they don't actually plan something like that in a story, then Frozen 3 does become another Rise of Skywalker 2.0, and the entire trilogy just becomes one big mess as a result. Because keep in mind, I used to love Frozen with all my heart, as it was my favorite film at the time, where I really wanted them to succeed, and still do to some extent, and would actually hate to see it squandered yet again, where my hatred of it now stems from the fact of these lackluster decisions that butcher any meaning that they could have actually had in the first place. Like, why feature any of them if you're going to truly have no plan for them at all? And remember, if these recent box office disappointments are actually to go by, then they really do need to figure it out in the middle of other sequels like Zootopia coming out by the studio, where I can say at the very least, it seems like they did put the lid on Ralph for now, before doing any more damage that could have come to that franchise with what the last film entailed as one of the worst sequels ever. But going back to other characters like Kristoff, Sven, and Olaf is another what then question. Like, what can we do to balance this trio out to stand amidst our other main two, since their involvement again with Frozen was very pathetic in the first place? Like, how can you balance other character of Olaf again in a role similar of that to the first rather than something oversaturated in the second and the other short stories. And where does Kristoff actually overall fit into this picture? Because once again, he was only in the second film to care about proposing to Anna and nothing more. Never mind the fact that their home could have been destroyed or any of the sort where his girlfriend at the time and sister were actually dealing to save with that, but just actually trying to marry her and nothing more. Like, he does care somewhat, but he cares more about the situation of proposing to Anna, and that conflicts with the overall story that's being presented that could result in the death of their own kingdom. I mean, I could come from the angle that he's already completed that journey and can fully help this time to support both of them, but I just want to ask what he will be able to do in this capacity. Something that can develop his own character forward instead of tagging along for the adventure as he had done overall, helping with his own skills to figure something out rather than the lackluster way they tried to prop up his character in the original. Because I also still feel disappointed by that portrayal and what he was supposed to represent and how he actually tags along, and how his family of trolls just contradict what he believed in not marrying someone you just met, and then having the trolls virtually almost marry them in the film for some reason. Like, you can clearly see where I'm coming from in this film, where how do you actually properly write his character into this adventure and help with whatever threat the family actually may face, whatever reason you give to the new story and conflict for. And at the very least, I don't doubt they can come up with interesting things for our characters in the movie, because that is still an element that works overall in the entire film and why they're famous to begin with, making waves in some shape or form with these fun musical moments. It's just the execution of the said story that I'm worried about overall, where I don't think we can continue the same way we were going since Frozen 2 and also have a fake out emotional death like the Star Wars films in Olaf 2, similar to how he almost died in the first, where he almost was melting joke-wise and then of course snapped out of existence until it turned out that it didn't actually matter in the end of the film because Elsa was just frozen and then unfrozen and somehow knew he was gone and managed to bring him back because everything in this damn movie didn't have time. Like, what kind of story do you have for them other than what we have already explained, that we have to balance out his entire personality? How can you feel or connect to the emotional moments of the film if you already went through it in such an arc? It doesn't make sense to redo it unless you actually stick to that, and if you stick to that, you kind of dilute the point that you are going for in the last two films. And this is the problem that fake out deaths have that makes the story harder to work around, where you can only hope that they do have the proper time for these types of stories to actually work, but still hinges on the facts of what Frozen 2 left in its bitter sour taste. It's just how I don't understand how Disney is not capable or able to make competent sequels at all compared to what we just saw with Pixar able to produce that of Toy Story 2 to such great success, where the closest they themselves actually been able to make a good sequel was with Cinderella 3, where that was even only a direct-to-DVD sequel not produced by Walt Disney Animation themselves. It only makes you wish a certain situation where when Peter Schneider was still at Disney Animation and Michael Eisner was CEO, that they just went with their skepticism of these Disney sequels when they started with Aladdin Return of Jafar and just cancelled it then and there, because most of the time they just never really offered anything really. But if Frozen 3 is even going to work, then we actually have to take steps from Toy Story 3, managing to actually round off the story so well, which also, to be fair, was followed up by Toy Story 2, but still made for a competent final regardless, having the overall themes continued in a way and actually having a villain to challenge throughout, disguised as a relatable situation that the characters actually found themselves in working their way out. The point here is that the film actually utilized all its characters in a unique balance without giving something up like Frozen actually had to tell its story. A story that really wanted to tell something more serious growing up with its audience that actually watched the first, but couldn't actually find the legs to finish it. And oh, lastly, I almost forgot about their parents. Their story was actually not clear at all, where they really wanted to show that, but I just really didn't like it, as I discussed for the entire story, where they did explain some things in the story, but it just didn't feel natural to actually explain and actually felt rushed. Like, you actually have to ask the question about them, since they do play a part in the films in some way and remain to be important to the Arendelle sisters in some way or form, where the fact remains is that they are my least favorite and most hated parts of Frozen overall, where the actions was very stupid and never acknowledged in any right way and never will be at this point. I mean, the ending provides some closure that they will move on from them, but I'm not sure how you can move forward without some influence like they actually had overall. It's probably the most tricky situation where you still actually have to amend that in some way. How that happens I really can't tell, but also somewhat needed, as they really wanted to explore that and actually show as that has been shown by the deleted scenes. Like everyone has said, Frozen 2 actually had the most potential to surpass its predecessor, but just failed to do so with what little was given. I mean, the work behind the scenes was pretty phenomenal and I applaud most of their efforts, but also very sad that most of it was actually drowned and reworked for time, losing what they really wanted to do to explain it, where now in Disney's quest to restore the damage that they have dealt to their film divisions presents an ample opportunity and equal parts pessimistic and optimistic, where the story of Frozen 3 could actually work to great success if given the time to do so, or ultimately end in failure that they wouldn't care care regardless if it actually made money. I mean, the pessimist side in this situation actually speaks more to me, because despite the perceived attempted effort to try and blend their 2D style somewhat in Wish, these announcements mostly means they're going to stick to this 3D revival animated storytelling and not actually open up the option for more traditional 2D that is very much needed. Not that we know what their entire plans for the other movies are other than these announcements, but it's just still very clear as day that they want to stick to this formula regardless of what Disney themselves actually say to scale back in this year, where it still remains to be the same as what they've done to work before in the past decade in the modern era. And because of that, I have to find reasons to agree with what the studios produce as a fan of them and offer any other pointers to what I want is a story that isn't quite as good as many people have thought. But overall, in short, I just don't know if it's going to work or not, but really hope they actually probably have the time to figure out at least something out and actually put a villain in the story of Frozen, since they never remotely actually had one to begin with. And if they do this, then I think Frozen could actually succeed and end the trilogy on a good note, where one could actually hope that this is the peak of the entire franchise and not become another Toy Story that has already run its course and does not need to continue. Only so much you can actually do with that story, where this has actually become abundantly clear with Frozen 2's ending and potential, and a sign that Disney needs to lay back on this after the grand franchise failures that don't do the company any more favors. Because it's become clear that audiences these days, as we have learned, are not willing to take the easy way out and are smart at seeing through such disguises for the most part. And with that said, that's all I actually have to add, so I'm all done now, so goodbye.